Our ancestor was an animal which breathed water, had a swim bladder, a great swimming tail, an imperfect skull, and undoubtedly was a hermaphrodite. Here is a pleasant genealogy for mankind. Charles Darwin. In the ancient city of Uruk, there was a king named Gilgamesh. Though this king was no normal man, he was more god than man. King Gilgamesh was volatile and untamed. He would steal brides on their wedding night before the groom could consummate the wedding. He was a terror to his people. The gods were displeased with this king. He needed to be tamed. He needed a helper. So the gods made another man, a man fit to balance the god-man-king. This man would be more beast than man. He would live outside the city with the wild gazelles. His name was Enkidu. He was also a terror to the people. Men would set traps for game to feed the people of the city, and this beast man would free the animals, frustrating their hunting. A woman from the temple was sent to Enkidu with the goal to seduce him. She was successful in her attempts. Afterward, the wild beasts rejected Enkidu. He could no longer dwell beyond the walls of Uruk. Enkidu entered the city and found King Gilgamesh up to his normal activities of causing general mayhem amongst the people. Enkidu stepped in to stop Gilgamesh. The mighty god-man and the strong beast-man clashed in a wall-shaking wrestling match. This fight of man, god, and beast struck fear into the Uruk people. Eventually, King Gilgamesh won the fight against the beast-man Enkidu. In typical male fashion, they became inseparable friends. With this friendship, King Gilgamesh turned his eyes from the brides of Uruk to slaying giants and challenging the gods. The King's Hall podcast exists to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world. The question, what is man, has had many answers throughout history. We can see this from the stories that they tell, what their leaders embodied, and what their great thinkers said. This ideal man is often made in the image of the gods. The ancient Babylonians had Marduk, whose name meant bull calf of the sun. He was a violent god who created men and earth by destroying the sea goddess Tiamat. Her shredded body became the earth, and the bones of her armies became man. Men were created as slaves for the gods. Violence was a virtue because it was by which they were created. In one famous story, Plato was said to have been asked this question, what is man? The philosopher said that man is a featherless biped. Diogenes, an opponent of Plato, who, though not a good man, did have some pretty awesome king energy, at one time told Alexander the Great to move out of the way for, "You are blocking my sunlight." Anyway, Diogenes heard Plato's definition of man as a featherless biped, so he plucked a chicken, brought it to Plato's school, and said, "Here is Plato's man." The Greeks had Homer's example of the ideal man in Odysseus in the Odyssey. This man was crafty and had courage and strength. The Romans had the Romanitas, a philosophy containing the religious, political, customs, values, and way of life for the ideal Roman citizen. Fathers would raise their sons in the paideia of this Romanitas. In ages past, men have given many answers to this question, what is man? Is he part God, part animal, all animal? Can he form himself? Is he good or evil? Our age is no different. We, too, have offered many answers to this fundamental question. Today in the King's Hall, we ask the same question. What is man? We need to ask this question and give an answer that dovetails both the scriptures and reality if we were to put even one stone on top of another in the cathedral of the new Christendom. The correct answer to this question is so vital that if one part is wrong, like a small imperfection in the footings of a wall, it will lead to utter collapse. In fact, we've seen exactly this over the last 2 episodes as we crafted a statement of faith that encapsulates much of what our current apostate pagan culture confesses to be true about God and man, about truth, goodness, and beauty. Much of that pagan creed focused on precisely this question. What is man? If we are to tear down the green groves and high places of worship of these false gods, we need not only reveal their lies and their answer to this question, but also give the true answer. We need to clearly see the wrongness of the plastic man that they have propped up as the ideal, as the true man, and bring the axe of St. Boniface to bear at the root of the idols that man has erected in the ruins of Christendom. Their true man is no man at all, but a beast. And speaking of some wild half-man, half-beast, I am joined by my esteemed co-hosts Eric Kahn and Brian Sauvé. Say hello to the listeners, you featherless bipeds.
Who are you calling a featherless biped,
You.
Dan? Oh, ouch. It's specifically you, Eric.
So did you know when Diogenes presented the chicken Plato amended his definition to say a featherless biped with flat nails.
That was his big,
He was like,
this
yeah,
gets it now.
Galaxy brain moment.
Wow.
But,
Flat nails.
for as funny as that is, it's better than the Supreme Court justice in America.
Good point.
So,
Good point. Hey, Diogenes, not a bad. What was the other king energy moment in Diogenes'
so
life?
Diogenes, this guy was he was a Stoic philosopher. Eric probably knows a lot about him, being a philosophy major. I mean, come on. Diogenes, so he's got this meeting with Alexander the Great. Before he was great, he was still king. He wanted to meet Diogenes, who was like, he had this philosophy that man was dog, essentially. And so he would parade around in the nude or like barely clothed, lived in a barrel. He would defecate and urinate and do other things in public that I can't talk about. Half man, half beast. He was. And so Alexander wanted to meet this guy. So this is where like he wakes him up from his nap and Diogenes is like, could you please move? You're blocking my sunlight. And afterwards, Alexander's like, I think if I was not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes. And Diogenes says, if I was not me, I would also want to be Diogenes.
Terrible person, but wow.
I mean,
serious
sort of
king
based,
energy.
though.
I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So this first question, guys. Though we often think of ourselves as highly intelligent and scientific people like Diogenes living in barrels and such, and we've evolved past the absurdity of the old creation myths, our age has its own creation myths, no different really than Marduk of Babylon. What is our creation myth? What story do the pagans and high priests of science tell us today?
That's a great question, Dan. And I think that it's important to start by recognizing, you just said that scientists are priests in our culture. And we were talking about this earlier before Eric rolled in to record this episode. But, hundreds or even 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it would be commonplace for people to think of the issue of authority and truth, like who decides and tells us what's true, to be the priests. You'd go to the priests at the temple and they would say, this is what God says. And you would lend a tremendous weight of authority to those voices. And it's funny that in our age, we do think we've evolved past this, but scientists certainly function like this in our culture. They tend to speak with far greater certainty than the science itself would really lend. And even science itself is if you do it right, is a continually self-correcting process of observation, testing, thesis, antithesis, all of that. And yet we appoint scientists as high priests. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, because what is a priest fundamentally? And I'm not even talking within Christianity. What is a priest? Is like somebody that is an intermediary for God.
Exactly.
And so scientists seem to like to fill this role. I mean, there are other priests other than scientists, though, too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to look far in our university system to see this.
Celebrities, professors.
Yeah, celebrities, professors, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I would say ultimately it's anybody in the culture who is saying essentially, thus saith the Lord. So, we've seen this with people who may have headed up things like the CDC. People looked to them and said, trust the experts. And it was pretty much, that was the thus saith the Lord. So I think culturally the thing is we don't escape these things, but the question is what story, Dan, you asked, what story do we see ourselves in?
Yeah.
And I think this was something I was reading recently in Future Man, Doug Wilson, but he says this about mythology. You can think of C.S. Lewis and what's a true myth?
His true myth, yeah.
What's a true myth? But Doug Wilson quotes Ambrose Bierce, who said this: mythology was the body of a primitive people's beliefs concerning its origins, early history, heroes, deities, and so forth, as distinguished from the true accounts, which it invents later. So I think his point there was Doug is saying, hey, look, our sons are dragon slayers and somebody ought to tell them.
Yeah.
And we're part of this grand story, but post-Enlightenment, we've reduced everything to man is a thinking man. He just needs facts.
Yeah.
He needs a widget.
Yep.
He needs a spreadsheet, and that's it.
Yeah.
But we haven't actually escaped mythology.
No, and all of human society today is basically, I think, secular Western society is founded on this 3-part myth that basically is aimed at making man into his own God. Like, these components are not actually the result of following the evidence scientifically wherever it leads. That's what they pretend that it is. But what's really happening is that sinful man started with this predetermined conclusion, and the conclusion was we're in charge. We are gods. that there is no God who can tell me this is who you are, this is what you're for, this is the moral ought in the universe. And then we reverse engineered a creation story, a myth, to result in that conclusion and justify that conclusion.
You mean like creating self-creation?
Yes,
in a way?
self-creation, where we said, here's the conclusion we want to end with. Here's the anthropology we want to land on. Man is a self-determining natural God. He determines himself. He defines himself. He owns his entry in the dictionary. His desires are fiat, divine fiat. And so they came up with this myth that really undergirds an astonishing amount of current Western culture, secularist culture. And it's this myth that, number one, all things came from nothing by a merely natural process.
So evolution.
Yeah, this is even prior. This is like
Big Bang kind of stuff.
Big Bang, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So matter itself doesn't need an explanation. Second, life came from non-life. So you had this non-living world of things. And then from that, again, through merely natural processes, life comes from non-life. And then third, all living things descended with modification and differentiation through entirely natural processes. This is Darwinism, resulting in all of the various forms of life we see today. And crucially, that includes man. For the project of this season to be successful, the project of seeing a new Christendom built, there will need to be thousands and thousands of Christian men and women who are equipped to stand for the truth of Scripture against the errors of both the liberal church and the pagan culture. This is one reason we're so glad to be partnering with our sponsor for this season, Reformation Heritage Books. Reformation Heritage Books offers a large selection of helpful and theologically rigorous resources on everything from biblical theology to history to blue-collar family discipleship, the type of library and resources that could make the kind of men and women I just described, grounded in the rich heritage of the Reformed faith. We'd like to highlight one resource in particular, their Family Worship Bible Guide, that presents rich devotional thoughts on all 1,189 chapters of the Bible, including searching questions to promote conversation and to help you in leading your family in such a way as to say with Joshua, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Tap the link in the description of this episode to pick one up today. So everything came from nothing. That nothing gave birth to life through natural processes, and then that life differentiated and ended up with us.
So can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If that's your view, it's like an anti-creation view.
Yeah.
Can you really have a morality?
No, it renders it morality, I think, and later even we're going to talk about this in more depth, but it's like you get, if you tell that story, then at the bottom you're saying, well, everything's malleable and plastic and changeable because life is continually changing, matter's continually changing, there's no governing principle or God. So ultimately, whatever's at the top of that food chain, it gets to be God. And you see how we started with that conclusion. We're gods, and we reverse engineered the answer, the myth.
So I'm genuinely curious. I don't know this answer. I'm asking, what is the solution in this evolutionary mindset for the problem of matter existing in the first place? How do they explain that?
You have a guy a few years back named Dr. Lawrence Krauss, for example. He was big in the world of pop culture. He was doing a lot of late night talk shows. He was on Stephen Colbert and other stuff. And he's kind of like this smash mouth physicist kind of guy, where he's like an egg-headed math guy who then wants to be a celebrity. He wants to be a Richard Dawkins. So he's super brash atheist. He wrote a book called, I think it was called The Universe from Nothing. What was it? I think I wrote it down. Yeah, it's called A Universe from Nothing, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. And then he wrote this, honestly, completely absurd. Let me read some quotes from him.
You actually had stuff on this.
I have some quotes, yeah. He said this. Speaking of myth, I want you to hear the mythology language here. He said, "The amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They were created in the nuclear furnaces of stars. And the only way they could get into your body is if those stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus." The stars died so that you could be here
Okay,
today.
okay.
But kind stars.
Very kind
So
stars.
I just gave a small account of the Babylonian creation
Yeah.
account of Marduk.
Yeah,
That sounds exactly like that.
same
There was
story.
like Tiamat, and then which was the goddess of the salt water, and then there was another god who was the god of the fresh water.
Yeah.
And the world was uncreated. It was just a world of water
Chaos and
and chaos and turmoil. Well, they made other gods.
yeah.
And then those gods made other gods,
Yeah.
which created chaos. And so they went to war and created Marduk, who was the sun god, and then the bodies of these gods, and everything made people. It's the same myth.
Well, what's weird to me is we look back at the ancients, post-Enlightenment, we look back at the ancients and we think, oh, that's absurd.
Yeah.
Come on, Gilgamesh myth.
Come
or-
on, man.
Yeah, they look at Noah, the flood account, stuff like that, and they say, oh, that's ridiculous. But I tell you what isn't ridiculous is kind stars.
He even says
Benevolent
they
stars.
can't help but ascribe, like they can't help but make nature a god with a purpose. So he even says, quote, nature is more imaginative than we are, right? Which is, let me just read this last quote. This is actually the height of absurdity. This demonstrates the absurdity of Krauss's worldview because, and actually it also demonstrates the embarrassing level of discourse and state of metaphysics amongst these pop culture scientists like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, these new atheists. There's a reason that they're dustbin kind of guys because they're just not serious thinkers. He said nothing. He's arguing because people would say, well, Lawrence Krauss, you said the universe came from nothing. But then when you actually look at what he means by nothing, he means something. He means this quantum foam state that existed before the formation of matter and some different really highly technical, models within theoretical physics. But
It's all very big brain. You wouldn't understand.
yeah, so he says,
And kind stars.
he's like, yeah, nothing, they insist, is not any of the things I discuss. Nothing, they say, is non-being in some vague and ill-defined sense. So, this is our whole reaction to his worldview is all you've done is moved it back one more domino. So he continues, some philosophers and many theologians define and redefine nothing as not being any of the versions of nothing that scientists currently describe. Think about describing nothing. Nothing has no potentialities, no properties. It is non-being. It
There's
is no
a lot
thing.
of nothing going on in Lawrence Krauss's mind.
He says, but therein, in my opinion, lies the intellectual bankruptcy of much of theology and some of modern philosophy. For surely nothing is every bit as physical as something.
What?
Especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. Lawrence Krauss sounds like he is doing shrooms.
This is literally like sophomore year metaphysics class with Tom Tree Logan.
Yeah.
It's like I literally wrote a paper one time that
Yeah.
was just like this, and I was like, I'm going to be as absurd as possible.
Yeah, just
It was the best grade I got that semester.
like, you're a deep thinker, Eric.
and I was like, I literally don't know what I said.
I literally said nothing is something.
It's like Bob Dylan writing a song right here.
When Proverbs 14:1 says that the fool says in his heart, there is no God, they are corrupt, they do abominable deeds, there is none who does good. You might think that's kind of harsh. And then you meet some of these guys and you're like, no, accurate. Solomon nailed it.
100% true.
They are wise fools. Like when Gandalf calls Saruman a wise fool. Because he's trying to figure out how to win instead of just doing the right thing, like obeying God, Eru, Iluvatar, whatever. Instead, Saruman's like, I'm gonna win. I'm gonna get power. I'm gonna join with Sauron. And Gandalf's like, you wise fool. You for all of your subtlety, you have not wisdom.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'm glad you brought Lord of the Rings into this.
You're welcome. Actually, that was also a Denethor quote.
It also in Future Man, what I was referencing, Doug Wilson says actually our Science Academy and post-Enlightenment thinkers and Senate has actually voted Saruman into office, was his quote.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's actually fantastic.
Can we just...
That's better. That's a better one.
It's from Doug.
Thank you. Thank you. Dan is here actually not to contribute to the discussion, but to rate both Eric and my contributions and decide whose was better. And I just lost. And you know what? I deserve the L.
He just quoted Doug.
I deserve the L.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously, you had something.
I was just going to say, we should, to wrap it up, we laughed at this idea, but this idea that everything came from nothing. The problem is, because the other horn of the dilemma, you either have to account for the universe for something existing, or you have to say that everything is eternal, that matter is eternal. Some models of physics, they'll say there's an infinite regress of multiverses and all this stuff. It's honestly, it's wise tomfoolery. It's like jargony tomfoolery, because the more that we learn, the more that we plumb the depths of the mysteries and glories that God has hidden in his creation, the more we cry out, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. The more we learn about the cosmos, the intricate mathematical precision with which God wove together the fabric of matter and reality, and the knife's edge that he balanced existence itself upon in our universe, like the math to let matter form at all, is astonishingly precise. You just go, only an idiot could come up with the idea that this popped into existence from nothing.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, the human body alone, we're sitting here and you're like, you have an organic matter heart that is running on electrical current.
Yeah.
And if any of that is wrong by like any degree, you die.
You die. The end is always you die.
You die.
Or in physics, the math is always, and there are no stars. Like, we can describe universes that have slightly different parameters for like the strong and weak nuclear force, and different. It's called the fine-tuning argument. And an astonishing number of the universes that are possible don't create stars or matter, or like you just couldn't. Not only could you not have life, but you wouldn't have anything.
Matter.
You wouldn't have matter.
Well, you'd have nothing, which is something.
You would just have a chaos of nothing something, of quantum foam. You know, it would just be like, so what I think people need to understand is that these high priests of science, they stand up and they, with utter confidence, declaim things like Lawrence Krauss does. And when you actually poke at it for like half a second with the intellectual capability of a second grader, like a second grader could question Lawrence Krauss and reveal the utter absurdity of his worldview. Any second grader at St. Brendan's, guarantee you. That's how absurd you end up becoming the moment you deny a creator. But you see how we're not following the evidence. We're reverse engineering a creation myth to result in man being God.
Well, and really it reveals that there is no such thing as a neutral party. Like,
Right.
we're just going to do science, and then whatever the outcome, then we'll just follow the results. But you start with presuppositions like materialism. You know, we're naturalists or materialistic.
Yeah.
You know, so there is no metaphysical other than benevolent stars.
Yeah.
And the reality is, what they're denying is that humans, as we said in past episodes, humans are, homo liturgicus or adorans, I think Brian said. Man
Stolen
is,
from Doug again. But
yeah, again, and James K.A. Smith. But, the fact that we're inherently in our core religious, we're worshiping creatures. And so even when they're trying to lean back on this historical materialism, they end up worshiping and turning, scientists into priests, as we were saying before. So it's an inescapable reality that you're a worshiping creature.
Yeah.
And that you're going to become like what you worship. So you look at, I would even apply it to the culture today. What does that historical materialism lead to? Well, the deification of the human body.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in, Salt Lake. We're in, plastic surgery capital of the world. Why?
Right.
Because we've deified bodies.
Yep.
And then you look at the Christian response to this, I think, so often, which is, okay, well, then we're going to be Gnostic.
Right.
And all of it is tied back to it's fundamentally a bad understanding of creation for the Christian and for the pagan.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this materialistic, the invention of matter, something from nothing, apparently, even though nothing is something. I'm actually really confused about that. So part of this creation myth, it doesn't depend on the origins of matter and space, but also, like Eric was saying, like people, like humans, creatures. Life, yeah, exactly. And so we just looked at Lawrence Krauss.
Lawrence Krauss, yep.
And the creation of matter. So who would be the kingpin of the mythos of creatures being made?
Yeah.
And would he be wrong?
Yeah, because, I mean, obviously the next step in that three-part creed, we have the creation of everything from nothing. Then we have the creation of life from non-life through physical processes, which, again, we didn't touch on that, but everything we said about the universe from nothing, you can say about abiogenesis, this idea of the first cell forming. I mean, if you go to a biology class in college, they'll give you like, oh, we have the RNA world hypothesis, and they'll throw a bunch of terms at you and hypotheses at you as if that should tell you we've got this under control. Like, we've got a few T's to cross and I's to dot, but we've pretty much figured out. I mean, the Stanley Miller experiment.
There was water,
right?
and there was like RNA floating around in there, and electricity, static, something, and they What I mean,
Yeah, there are multiple theories, and all of them at the bottom. You actually don't need to understand the theories. You just need to understand that even the scientists in the field studying this, they all know that they don't know how this could possibly happen. They're certain that it did happen because, again, there's no God.
On a Tuesday, 12 billion years ago.
Right. We're certain it happened. And now let's figure out how, Yeah. So Darwin is the next step, though, that, okay, let's give him life. Then how do you get man from the first cell? Well, Darwinism. Darwin is obviously one of the horsemen, one of the four horsemen of this apocalyptic secularist worldview. And the problem with Darwin is that he's wrong. Darwinism doesn't work. And again, at every step, that deeply matters because their entire creation story is not a true myth, but a false myth.
so you just assert he's wrong. Why is he wrong?
He's wrong.
Like, why is he wrong?
I said so? No.
I mean, he said that
Yeah.
we have odd-shaped skulls and swim bladders and tails.
Right.
And
That's our ancestor.
are undoubtedly, which is a really hard word for me to say, undoubtedly.
Is it indubitably or undoubtedly?
Undoubtedly
Oh.
was a hermaphrodite. I can say that word.
So I know
So-
I'm talking a lot in this episode so far, guys. It's because I'm the token nerd.
You didn't have to say that. Everybody knows.
Everybody knows. Who reads about the RNA world hypothesis,
And remembers it.
and it's fascinating to me.
Instead, when I read it, I'm just like static. It doesn't make sense.
Which, by the way, is the idea that RNA formed before DNA. But
I was just laughing when you kept saying Enkidu because
It's Enkidu.
I always
Yeah.
read that as Enkaidu.
yeah,
Oh.
Enkidu.
Oh,
And so
I don't know.
Enkidu sounds like toddler speak.
Or like a squid, like a
Yes,
nickname for a squid.
yes.
Come here, Enkidu.
Yeah.
So I was thinking of like SpongeBob, and you guys were on like Galaxy Brain.
we
stuff?
were Galaxy Brain.
yeah,
yeah.
big time.
I had just heard it from somebody else. So I will blame this random person.
Yeah, I like
that
it.
Heard
I actually
Pronounce-
I always said Uruk,
Uruk.
but when you said Uruk, I was like, that sounds way more right.
Oh, I bet both are wrong because I don't speak ancient
And
Mesopotamian.
it made me wonder if Tolkien got the
Babylonian.
Uruk-hai.
oh, the
If
Uruk.
he developed some
yeah.
of that from
Oh, because they're like beasts.
the orc language which would be a total Tolkien move.
You know what's really interesting about that story? I just said like God man and beast man, but he was actually Gilgamesh was 2/3 God and 1/3 man.
Yeah.
And Enkidu was the other way around. He was
Yeah.
2/3 beast,
2/3
and 1/3
beast.
man. I want to talk about it a lot, but it has nothing
Again,
really to do with what we were
a
talking.
lot of these answers that people have been, we think again that we've answered this question in a totally different way. What is man? Well, look, I mean, they were saying that man was some mix of God and beast. He was some kind of animal all the way. This is not new. And the way that the scriptures answer this, as I was thinking about this, preparing for this show, just kind of astonished me again. And it was something that Gregory of Nyssa wrote in, church father early in the history of the church. He was explaining and kind of worshiping God in light of the fact that one of the things that separates man from the animals, that man is not just spiritual, or not just spiritual, not just physical. He's an embodied soul made in God's image. Is that because he's God's image bearer, with this body and soul, man is uniquely capable of participating in communion with the divine nature. Right? And like, this sounds wrong. It's one of those verses that I remember the first time that I really wrestled with it. I don't know if I was a young man or teenager or what it was, but in 2 Peter 1, 3, and 4, Peter writes, his divine power has granted to us, he's talking about Christians, is granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence. And this is the key part, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them, through these promises of God, you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. So you have this you have Buddhist conceptions where everything is God, or these Eastern mysticism, everything is God, I'm part of God, or I need to transcend back into the one, be reabsorbed into God. You have these atheistic secularism where there is no God, it's all, nothing, it's just matter. Well, Christians say, no, there's a creator and a creation. We're a part of the creation. We are not like sparks of the divine. And yet, we were made to be partakers of the divine nature. That's a radical, that blows my mind when I think about it. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, it sounds such a heady thing where you get into sort of the mystery side of things.
Yeah.
And I think the tricky part is, right, we're in Utah.
Right.
And so you have to compare and contrast that continually with guys who are like, no, we are going to be gods owning planets.
Right.
And multiple wives or whatever.
I called
else.
you
Mormonism is a trip. That's all I'll say.
It is.
It's a trip,
It's like
man.
a sci-fi.
It is. Well,
It's totally a
anyway.
sci-fi. Anyway.
Yeah. Go
We're
ahead,
not talking about Mormonism, but our next question was supposed to be, it might be a mistake to say that man is good. And
Oh,
what do we
yeah.
mean? What do we don't mean? That was going to be our next question, but that begs the question. We're going to be partakers of, what did this say?
Partakers of the divine nature.
Of the divine nature. And the reason it feels wrong to me to say that is because of this question of man being good. Why would a created being that we assume to be just dirt and dust and miserable be allowed to be partakers in the divine glory?
I think the first distinguishing thing that is often lost, sometimes in Reformed camps, especially, like we want to fixate so much on depravity,
Right.
which is true, but there is a Genesis before chapter 3. And so that's good.
That's right.
God creates man and woman. He said, this is very good. So man and woman are the height of creation. And so what we see happening in the gospel even is redemption to that.
That's right.
While we obviously would admit to indwelling sin,
Mm-hmm.
a remnant of sin in believers, even, we're not advocating perfectionism. We are back on that path to the garden and to that glorified state, glorification.
That's right. Grace, it restores, perfects, and glorifies nature. So we have man who is fallen in his spirit and his body. There's physical corruption and spiritual corruption. He wants to do bad things, or he does bad things because he wants to do bad things because his heart is corrupt. So what we need is a bridge that will return us to a state of communion with God. And so that bridge ends up being the only possible bridge, which is a true human who is also true God, who can bridge, therefore, be the high priest to bridge true man to true God. So Christ comes to be that bridge, and that's the gospel. But then as you continue to follow this arc of redemption, like 1 Corinthians 13 says that there will be a time when we know as we're fully known. He says in 2 Corinthians 3:18 that we all behold with unveiled faces, unlike Moses when he beheld God. We all with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of God, are being transformed from one degree to another into the same image, into the image of the God-man. So the whole arc of the Christian anthropology isn't just to say that man is this creation of God who is made in the image of God. It's to say, and he's fallen, but yet God is through the God-man Christ, not just restoring him to perfection or to innocence, but to glory, beyond innocence to glory, to be partakers of the divine nature, to actually commune with God. And so this is why it is so horrific to reduce man to animal. Because what you have just done is you've removed from him the very source of his being and his purpose. You have made him a beast. You've guaranteed his misery. You've removed the organ and demanded the function, to use C.S. Lewis's language. You're basically telling him, this is the secular Western creed. It says, be yourself. That's the highest end. And yet you've removed the foundation for him to actually be his truest self, which is the image of God. So it's the most depressing possible worldview when you remove the image of God and then you tell people, yeah, find the answer in yourself, and here's what you are. You're an animal. You've given them a lie to find themselves in. And so they can't.
And so the secular world is saying, actually aim at being a beast.
Aim at beastliness.
Beastliness. Whereas Christianity is not saying, like the Gnostics would say, or like all those other examples of Buddhists, transcend your humanity, escape from your humanity, but instead through death, burial, and resurrection, become the fullest human possible.
And see, this to your question, so when they say like Rousseauian natural man is good, the problem with that is that what I just described is what you're doing. You're saying man is good, and what we mean is that beast is good. And so be the beast. You're just a creature. You're not the image of God. Throw off that outdated mythology of Christ. Throw that off and become your true self. But what is that true self? It ends up being a beast. And so everything else we're going to talk about in the next episode is the sexual sin, the depravity that comes from the psychologizing and Freudian sexuality, and all of this utter absurdity that's happening in our current in the fruit of our current anthropology, which is sexual mayhem right now, that is exactly what you get when you tell people, be yourself, after telling them that what their self is a beast.
Okay, so in closing, why is right anthropology central to the project of New Christendom? Why is this so essential to this next project? Because it seems like from your tweet, the 20th century has been pretty horrific. And people look at the Middle Ages and they're like, yeah, that's the Dark Ages. They were dark. They were terrible. People were eating mud.
We're enlightened now.
Yeah, you had literally hundreds of millions of people being murdered and starved in the 20th century, and you've transcended. So why is this important going forward?
Well, I think the reality is, so man is the crown of creation, as I said before. He's the very good at the very end of everything that God makes. Yeah. But I think because of that, he's also the depths of where creation can go when man falls.
Oh, that's good.
So then I think you look at the work of Christ, and what does Christ do? Does he come first and say, I have come to redeem or to build the cities? No, I came to redeem man first and foremost.
That's right.
Because he understands Christ is returning us, and in fact, even in an elevated glory, but he's bringing us back into that garden function as men. So when you look at what Christ is doing, it's restoring man to the creational purpose, and then saying, I'm going to unleash you on an even greater mission than you could have understood in Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And it's going to be through the power of the Spirit. So, you know, when you look at Brian, especially like John's gospel, it's all new creation language.
Yeah.
Like recreation again. So Christ has come to do that. We see it in Romans 8 as well. Even the creation is groaning. And so man is put as this central pivotal thing. Christ says, I'm going to redeem that. I'm going to redeem him to his former glory.
Yeah.
Through my death, burial, and resurrection, and now we're going to build Christendom. So men is central to anthropology is central to all of this.
Yeah, because the anthropology that we have right now, if men are beasts, it's kind of like in the conservation world, in the hunting world, you have to manage the population. And so you see man as almost being this pest that is really doing damage to the whole ecosystem of this naturalistic world, this God essentially that they've made of science. I don't know.
Yeah, he's
scare quote science.
Nasty consumer, not a producer.
He's a virus.
Correct. Yeah. Whereas
he's a non-native species.
What Christianity says is, no, men are valuable.
That's
Women are valuable, which is radical in history.
Radical.
Children are valuable.
Radical.
Unbelievably radical. And actually the point of human existence is for flourishing, to make this into a garden world where people are actually blessings to this place and are to fill every corner of the earth.
The Christian story, to Eric's original point, you know, reading Doug and that the story, understanding the story, the Christian story is the only story that will give you consistently a creation, an orderly creation, a cosmos, and not a chaos. Because all of these other stories, they tell the story of man as beast, and so he ends up just being an invasive thing to be managed. But all of this biblical anthropology is aimed at man ruling. It's aimed at creation not properly flourishing unless man is ruling it, which is why even the verse you cited in Romans 8, that creation is groaning, it specifically even says creation is longing for the revealing of the sons of God.
Because they are the order bringers in chaos.
That's right. The creation is not going to come to its flowering until the church, until the people of God, renovated in the image of the God-man, take up their sword and trowel and go out and cultivate it. Creation is not this God that we're supposed to leave in perfect balance by itself. Creation needs tending by the hand of man. That's radical, because what that does is that, and this is the culmination of this Christian anthropology, is that it gives man his purpose of ruling in the name of God, bringing the image of glory of God to everywhere that he goes. And so I think, you know, as we're going to discuss in the next episodes, and continue to refute this creed of the secularist Western man, we're going to talk about how much damage has been done and how much carnage has flowed out of this demonic anthropology of our modern day, where man doesn't stop taking dominion just when he believes a lie about himself, but he actually takes demonic dominion. And so what we're going to continue to see is that really the whole project of this season is the right focus of the human life, which is to build the city of God. It's to build Christendom. It's to build creation tended by the hand of the revealed sons of God, the glorified hand of glorified man in the name of Christ, with his wisdom, because the reality is so much of what we're going to discuss, of the craziness and sexual perversions, they actually came about because of Christian apostasy in the West. They came out because we, the people of God, capitulated. We gave up our inheritance. We demurred on the actual nature of man. We're the ones who fell asleep on the wall, and we let the demons creep in and tell a more compelling story than the true story. And so the solution just has to be, it has to come out of and flow over the threshold of the temple. Right? The solution has to be that we come and we tell the true story more compellingly and more powerfully than the false demonic story that they're telling, because the right view of men and women and children and family and the mission of God is going to produce blessing for the nation, where their story is just producing death and carnage.
Brothers, let us not waver in the face of this false god of Darwinism. Man is no mere animal. You bear the image of the one true and living God. Let us sharpen our axes to a razor edge, and like our spiritual forefather St. Boniface, let loose a mighty hail of blows against the tree of Darwinism, proclaiming the rule and reign of the Lord Jesus Christ, the God-man, who rules over all things in heaven and on earth and under the earth. Thanks for listening to this episode of the King's Hall. We'd invite you to head to kingshall.org to find out more about our mission and aim with this project, as well as some ways to support the show. Our monthly supporters at patreon.com/thekingshall gain access to special bonus show with every main episode. So if you want to hear more of us, tune into After Hours.
Who wouldn't?
And who wouldn't?
Who wouldn't?
You actually get to hear a little special toast every time,
That's
too.
right.
That's just bonus. Anyway, we'll be back next week to put a few more stones in the foundation of this new Christendom cathedral. And remember, he conquers who conquers himself.